Before we start, I'd like to say that none of what will be said in this video is intended to be a jab at Toshihiro Nagoshi, the creator of Yakuza or Like a Dragon, or anyone who liked the games under him. I've been with this franchise from the very beginning with the first game, and I've enjoyed games under his supervision and even now after his departure. This video aims more so to try and decrease the grand delusions that some may have about how this man carried the whole franchise on his back, like the guy wrote every single game, composed every single track, created the engines himself, when the team has many talented people that we don't even know the names of. There are times where it legitimately feels like nobody actually knows Nagoshi or how he approached making the Yakuza games. I'm sure some of you may have seen discussions or debates or arguments or literal death matches going around the internet in the past year or two about how things with RGG Studio aren't the same now that Nagoshi is no longer with them. This is a topic that I feel like having a video on will sort of lift a weight off of my shoulders, because having answers or a discussion all in one place about this particular topic might be very much needed at this point of time. Having said that though, if I'm being brutally honest, the majority of people that I see attribute whatever to Nagoshi leaving RGG Studio don't even play the games. Most of the time they're just rage baiting or engagement baiting, but of course the keyword is majority. I know there are people that love the franchise who think that, but they also don't lose their cool with the topic, and you can actually talk to them. So, whether or not you're one such person, welcome to this video. In today's video, we'll be talking about Nagoshi, RGG Studio, and we'll go through several interviews with him and see what the mind behind the Yakuza series has to say regarding specific matters that are relevant to the following question. Did Nagoshi's departure truly ruin the Yakuza franchise? If you want a very short answer, bro, just look at how much the games are selling compared to, I don't know, 2010. Games that aren't fun or good aren't gonna sell. And I know what you may be thinking, oh, but there's this and that game that aren't fun and they also sold well. And to that I say, you said it yourself. You don't find it fun. Just because you don't find something fun doesn't mean everybody else will follow suit. Let's say a game has a lot of hype around it and once it releases, it gets a lot of sales, but it turns out to be something that people shit on for a while. Cyberpunk. You can't compare something like that to a franchise of over 10 games. If people start with a game that they don't find fun, they won't stick around for the rest. It's as simple as that. I've seen people that just flat out refuse to look at the bigger picture when it comes to a game's reception. Like, yes, what you think of the game is the most important thing. To you, that is. I feel like this has been happening with every single release for years now, but there are people who still stick around just to remind everyone that they don't like the franchise anymore, and it's like, okay, just find something that makes you happy, man. You'll thank yourself. You don't have to bring everyone else down with you. Toshihiro Nagoshi is the person responsible for pushing the draft of the Yakuza games to higher management, who refused his idea multiple times, but he kept trying until they actually gave it a try, and now the franchise has come so far. In October 2021, Nagoshi left Sega to establish Nagoshi Studios under NetEase, a company mostly known for mobile games. With him leaving, the leadership went to Masayoshi Yokoyama, who was the series producer and writer ever since the very beginning. Sometimes I feel like people forget that fact and think everyone in the studio are new hires or something. It's worth noting that it wasn't solely Yokoyama that wrote every single game. Sometimes he had someone else with him, like in the case of Yakuza 1 and 2, where a crime novelist by the name of Hase Seishu also worked on it. Some of the most quote-unquote controversial games, and excuse me for that phrase because to be honest, depending on the day, it feels like every title becomes controversial, depending on when people choose to talk about it. But anyway, some of the most controversial games, story-wise, were written by Yokoyama, such as Yakuza 4 and 5, and if you've played those two, I don't think I need to explain what makes them a hot topic. You may really like them, and that's okay, but you must know or have seen someone who lost their shit over something like rubber bullets or Yume and so on and so forth. And yet, Yokoyama also wrote what is considered possibly the best game in the whole franchise, Yakuza 0. How did that happen? Don't ask me. But you know what we do know for a fact? Nagoshi was around for both Yakuza 4 and 5's releases, and he was also around when Dead Souls came out, a game that many think is crap. And he was also around when we got Yakuza 3 in the West and had over 20 sub-stories and a bunch of side content completely cut. And he was also around when Yakuza 3 had timed DLC that he just can't access if he didn't get the game in time. And he was also around when we had to wait literal years to get a game localized, and he was also around when we got no spin-off besides Dead Souls localized. The list goes on, and yet no one in their right right mind attributed any of this to Nagoshi's leadership, and for damn good reason. Likely none of that was any of Nagoshi's fault. When you go back to the days of Yakuza 3 and 4 getting localized, the communication between RGG's team and Sega of America was way more limited compared to what it is now, where they have an English official page for the studio and actually work together closely with the Japanese branch. In an interview with QTA Quest, he mentions that they put a lot of budget behind the localization for Yakuza 1 and 2, and yet the sales were abysmal. He couldn't understand English, so he couldn't supervise it as well as he wanted, whereas I imagine that changed drastically now. He thought it sold horribly because he believed it was a game that only adult Japanese men could enjoy, which, to be honest, is something that I beg to differ with, and I'm sure you, as you're watching this, probably don't fully agree as well. Even with the F-bomb galore localization and the English dub of the first Yakuza game, at the time that I played it, I thought it was unlike anything that I've ever played, and I was like 10 fucking years old. An Arab 10-year-old, mind you, from some tiny-ass island that 90% of the world don't even know exists, and I still fell in love with it. And I know I'm only one person, so it might be selfish of me to say what I just said. Therefore, perhaps we'd be better off talking about how well Yakuza 0 did, which is an extremely Japanese game that had the very Japanese theme of the bubble era as an important factor of the game's setting. Because of proper localization and better communication between the teams, we got an experience that many people can enjoy. Yakuza 0 is concrete proof that it's not just a region problem. If you have a great story-heavy game on your hands that takes careful steps to convey its words to the masses, people will love it. A lot of the Yakuza games have themes of redemption, honor, betrayal, brotherhood, friendship, and these are all things most people can relate to. And it's not all just about the story, of course. Yakuza always stood out in terms of gameplay and what it has to offer, from the snappy combat to the virtual tourism aspect. There are a few things that people magically and conveniently forget when they blame current RGG studios for things like scummy DLC, which, let me say right now, because I've seen people that have difficulty understanding this concept, nobody likes that. Of course, none of us wants to pay for features that were previously part of the game. But guess what? Nagoshi was around when that idea happened. Everyone and their mothers seem to hate something like the PS5 Pro not having a disk drive, and yet it'll probably sell like hotcakes, because people will justify their purchase with any given reason. Japan was unlucky in that they got New Game Plus for Yakuza 7 as paid DLC. Us, outside of Japan, still not having simultaneous releases was a blessing in disguise at the time, because people were very vocal about this DLC that when the English release dropped, it was implemented in the base game, but unfortunately it remained monetized for Japan, which is ironic because Nagoshi always tried to prioritize Japan as the main demographic. Nagoshi was also around when Lost Judgment dropped, the first simultaneous release in the franchise, and with it, it brought a whole fighting style locked behind paid DLC. It's really funny because when that was first revealed, people were kind of weirded out, but I don't recall as much of a fuss over it as much as with now. Is it purely because Nagoshi was still around? Then why? Why didn't that cause as much of a debate? It's a fighting style that is linked closely to one of the school clubs, which is in the base game, where you unlock moves for it as you progress through that club. So it seems very odd to just cut it out and have you pay for it. This only tells me that people can be hypocrites about the whole Nagoshi debate. So hypocritical, it hurts. And then there's the genre shift with the Yakuza 7. Maybe people forgot that Nagoshi was also around for that, and that he himself felt like the formula needed some change after all the games we've had with Kiryu. It's one thing to still want Kiryu games, but it's another to not understand why they wouldn't want to switch it up after 9 whole games with Kiryu, and more if you count the spin-offs. Or what about the idea of character revivals? That's another thing that I've seen rile people up, and I'll admit, this is a point that I fully understand, as I also think they overdo it at times. But the point with this question is, why do people attribute this happening to Nagoshi leaving when someone like Kashiwagi returns in Yakuza 7, which is a game he was involved with? What about Lau Kalong just casually showing up in the same game, or them bringing back Jungi but not really? Somehow, 7 goes too far, but apparently it's no one's fault. Until after he leaves. There is a sad reality we all have to accept. Yakuza or Like a Dragon is among Sega's biggest hits now, and that is a big blessing, but it may also bring a bit of a curse with it. That success means it has more eyes on it by management or shareholders or whatnot. Things like microtransactions have already been around for a while, but I think it's only predictable that they'll try to capitalize on them as much as they can, given how much of a moneymaker the franchise is now. Companies like money. Big surprise, I know. But unfortunately, that's just how it is. I'm still going to talk about unreasonable DLC where it's necessary, but I'm a single man, and I can only do so much about that. I grew up with these games, and I love them. They're important to me because they allowed me to present myself to all of you watching this video, and I got to interact with plenty of wonderful people out there through the years. And on this topic, I might as well just say thank you for sticking around and watching someone who can be as annoying as me. Now I'd like to move on to talking about random snippets of interviews with Nagoshi, where he shares information that I think would complement this video. Let's get to them. In an official interview by Sega with Nagoshi, he mentions that it's important to know when to draw the line when it comes to asking the players for feedback on a game. In his experience, with games where he listened to feedback too much, it didn't work out so well. He says that at least if he implements mostly his ideas and watch those fail, at least he'll be able to reflect back on the experience because it would be all on him. After releasing the original Yakuza 1, someone from the staff told him that it might be better to focus on releasing Yakuza 2 around a year later, and that it should take priority over how much content they put in the game because the longer they take to release the sequel, the more likely the game will fade from people's minds, and that means they would have to invest more resources in promoting the game, which could be inefficient for budget and planning. Nagoshi thought he had a point and says that it's very possible if it wasn't for the staff member's suggestion, the series could have died within 10 years of its inception. It's really interesting because this one staff member might be the reason that we still get yearly releases to this day. This whole bit is also important to keep in mind because we're at a point of time where I've seen people who are concerned that we're getting too many releases in such a short amount of time, but it is extremely likely that after all this time and with the franchise's worldwide success, the team has many more resources at its disposal now with Yokoyama as its head. It's no exaggeration to say that Yakuza or Like a Dragon is straight up a poster boy for Sega alongside the likes of Sonic now. Once upon a time, that was not the case. And even back then, they somehow still managed to get almost yearly releases. In another interview, Nagoshi talks about how when creating Yakuza, they kept thinking of the demographic they would appeal to, but ultimately decided to just follow what they feel like are able to do best. They didn't want to be too ambitious for the beginnings. They took worldwide appeal out of the equation, and after that, they took children out of the equation as a demographic. But that still wasn't enough. He mentions that women were also sort of taken out of the equation, so the goal became to create a game catered mainly to adult Japanese men. And now looking at this in hindsight, first of all, this didn't age well since it became a huge hit among all demographics. And second, it's very ironic. Speaking from personal experience, I got into this franchise when I was barely 10 years old, as I mentioned earlier. And I really don't need to mention just how popular it is with women. You have a franchise with boatloads of shirtless men and attractive women, and you think that's not gonna have that effect? Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to make Nagoshi look bad here or anything of the sort. After all, he is only talking about the beginning here. Plus, in 2005, one could argue that gaming wasn't where it is now, and that's why Nagoshi said what he said. A lot of people would see it as a quote-unquote man's hobby the more you go back in time. But that changed over time because people realized, hey, games are really fun and anyone can enjoy them. And again, I can tell you from personal experience that not even around 2005, but from around 4 years ago when I was still in university, I remember talking about video games to a classmate of mine and how it's a big hobby for me. She kinda jokingly scoffed and said she just sees them as like a children's toy or something to that effect. Though on that same wavelength, I met plenty of people during that time, both men and women, that also shared my interest of video games. Nagoshi also talked about the yearly releases and how every year in real life brings changes to Japan that they try to reflect in their games. For example, certain kinds of people may come and go. The clothes people wear will change. Gangs will differ over time. The ways in which they make money might change. New trends may appear. Crimes change in nature. This is something that Nagoshi himself states in this video, and simultaneously, this is also something that I've seen a lot of people take issue with, and they attribute the reason of why it's happening to the fact that Nagoshi is not working at RGG anymore, which, as you can see right now, is absolutely nonsensical. Let's take a very infamous example. Tatara, the VTuber in Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. Now, I'm not addressing anyone who criticized how she was portrayed or anyone who just doesn't like VTubers or, whatever. But with what we gather here, my criticism is pointed at people who will insinuate something as dumb as Tatara would never show up if Nagoshi was still around because, I don't know, he hates VTubers or something. That is absolutely false. VTubers became a trend much like how baseball and the idol industry were booming around 2012, which was reflected in Yakuza 5 heavily. Shinada is a whole protagonist made around the theme of baseball, and Haruka was a completely unique playable character where her gameplay was rhythm-based. And I've seen both, a lot of people who enjoyed the Haruka segment and the opposite. And yet I've never seen anybody criticize Nagoshi for that one. Nagoshi states that when making the Yakuza games, he didn't want the combat to be difficult, but for it to feel good. His intended audience is adult Japanese men, which he thought may not be super well versed with complicated button combinations, so he tried to keep it simple. Nagoshi mentions a survey he did a long time ago asking people about a certain famous game that he didn't name, but that game sold millions in the West apparently. He had people go through all sorts of questions, but the one he was really after was, did you finish the game? And to his surprise, only 30% of the players did. This surprised him. Because, say, if we had 2 million people that played the game, only about, 500,000 actually beat the game? This is interesting to me because even when Nagoshi was still around, some Yakuza games still had a lot of content to them to the point where people may just drop them. Yakuza 5. Nagoshi mentions that after finishing work on Yakuza 6, he had wondered about how to proceed with the series from there. Now get this, apparently the beginnings of the shift to the RPG genre started with him, and the team half-jokingly was wondering, how about we just switch to turn-based? And this one needs to be stressed. If there's anyone out there that's bitter about the genre shift and, attributes that to Nagoshi leaving or something, or like somehow it eluded the eyes of Nagoshi or something, well, he was in the same room as they were laughing about the idea. The April Fool's video that they showed years ago was really intended to just troll us by showing us that the next game was going to be turn-based, until they decided to go fully on board with the idea because the reception was so positive. Then he says something that's interesting. Hurrying to make things is sort of a characteristic of the Ryuga Gotoku studio. It's always like this. Now, as long as I've been a fan, I was fully aware of just how fast and efficient this team works. But the more time passes, I think this piece of information may slip through the cracks, and people may not know about it, especially as we keep getting new fans. So you'll see people saying, whoa, aren't they releasing games a little too fast? Nah, don't worry about it. This team is just built different. We've been getting yearly releases since the franchise's inception, and that hasn't really changed. They have multiple teams working on different aspects of the franchise, which Yokoyama said. And the fact that they don't shy away from reusing assets heavily contributes to their success and efficiency. So they have a team dedicated to minigames, a team dedicated to the combat, that kind of thing. In fact, Yokoyama himself says that reusing assets is something that the team is proud of. He thinks that other game studios shy away from doing that a little too much, and as a result, he just sees a lot of studios that try to create new assets every single game, which means a lot more dev time and a lot more budget. As for the genre shift, as much as some may want to deny it, there is a lot of evidence that shows the genre shift was essential to how successful Yakuza Like a Dragon was. Let's not forget that Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth sold over 1 million copies outside of Japan in only a few days. Now, for a lot of studios, that's a normal number, but for RGG Studio, that is huge. The way RGG Studio goes about their localization also greatly impacts player response to the games. Yakuza 0 is a giant example of that. Nagoshi states in an interview with QTA Quest that at first he thought the series just wouldn't work for a global audience, but he was really happy to see that it popped off as well as it did. Having said that though, the main goal was still to create a game for a Japanese audience first and foremost. They don't want to lose what makes the game special. Nagoshi states that he prefers implementing Japanese cities in the franchise, and he stresses the importance of that goal. But he also did state that at some point he would be interested in including a city that's outside of Japan. Now, I've seen reception from people saying that they don't like how the franchise goes into Hawaii in Infinite Wealth, and I also wonder if that would have still happened if he was around. Because you can see in multiple interviews that he really wants to prioritize Japan, whether it's about the demographic or the cities. If I had to give my own thoughts about this one, I thought it was refreshing visiting Hawaii because it was a completely new environment. I'm far away from both the US and Japan, so in a way, it still had that virtual tourism aspect to it that a lot of people love. And also, exploring a part of the US with Yakuza hits in a way that's much different than with any other game that takes place in the US. Because again, they do an incredible job at making the cities feel alive. Like yeah, you can wander around the US in GTA, but it just isn't the same for me. Nagoshi mentions having rules when it comes to creating Yakuza games. We can assume one of those is keeping the games in Japan until they feel the need to go out. He also restricted violence and gore, especially that by the playable characters, because he doesn't want anyone to think the games are glorifying that kind of behavior. He actually goes into that more than you'd expect. He really doesn't want to be the reason someone kills someone else over his games, to the point where he said that he would quit making games if that happened because he would be devastated. I get where he's coming from, but at the same time, it's not like these games glorify anything related to crime to begin with. If I'm being honest, there were several moments where I thought it would be fitting for a main character to kill someone, and I'm sure a lot of people felt the same way as well. But that's his philosophy in the end. The games he worked on were pretty fun, and all this ties to the point where we wonder what kind of decisions was he responsible for that only became possible after his departure. Nagoshi talks about a really intriguing piece of information. They were talking about spin-offs, and he apparently had an idea for a science fiction Yakuza game at some point. So he started writing ideas, and he really liked how ridiculous it was. At some point, he would have had the following sentence said to an alien: "How dare you step onto my star?" He was convinced in his idea, but the others called him crazy for it, so he just stopped pursuing that idea. I feel like this needs to get out there to people because some say that, again, after Nagoshi left, they got too silly with their games. And yet, here's the guy talking about wanting to see criminals talking smack to aliens. He was laughing quite a lot about it. He seemed really amused at the idea. So, what's the takeaway from this video? If you thought my intention was to undermine Nagoshi's efforts or to try and say that absolutely nothing changed with the franchise, or that the series has always been silly or whatever, that's not it. Nagoshi is the one who pitched the idea of the franchise to higher management, but it doesn't mean he wrote the entire series, which I think is where a lot of people make the mistake. As a director/producer/creative director, he 100% had a big hand in shaping how the games are like. But he's not the only person on the team. Someone in his position would likely look over decisions made by the people who do the actual work in drafting for his vision, and then he would give it the go-ahead or the opposite. That's what I imagine the bulk of his role was. Having said that though, I mentioned this briefly earlier in text, but Nagoshi was involved in the writing of the Kurohyou games, as well as both Judgment games. The aim with this video was to try and say that while Nagoshi's efforts were tremendous and essential to how the games came to be, there's a lot that we don't know about the actual inner workings. If you recall, not long ago we mentioned an employee who wasn't even named who brought forth the suggestion of trying to aim for yearly releases, and that's one part that defined the franchise for many fans, old and new. Was that the spark that caused RGG Studio to be known for their constant asset reuse ever since the beginning? Most likely. And the most amusing part is, we have not a single idea how many of the decisions we've come to love were brought forth by someone we don't even stop to think about. Usually, we just stop to thank the biggest name on the credits and move on. Looking at the interviews with Nagoshi, you get the impression that he tried to get the team to get used to how to approach making a Yakuza game, and while not everyone will think so, I think they're doing a good job. They still have a lot of the old guard, such as Yokoyama. As for the topic of change and how the franchise isn't the same anymore, you might have expected a comeback from me, but no, that's not really what I have to say about this. There will come a point in time where you may just lose interest in a franchise, and that's 100% normal. There is absolutely nothing wrong with admitting that a new direction isn't for you. But what I think matters the most here is you don't have to make others feel miserable for continuing to enjoy that franchise. To use an example that's very close to me, Resident Evil is a franchise that really went places in terms of where they tried to take their games. It started as a fixed camera angle horror franchise and then slowly leaned into action and switched into third person, which faced heavy backlash, despite later becoming very popular. Sound familiar? That's a lot like the shift from Yakuza 6 to Yakuza Like a Dragon. There's plenty of interviews with Nagoshi out there that'll give you deep insight into how he approached the creation of the Yakuza games. I try to implement what I think are some of the most important ones here, but you could always do a little hunting on your own too. So I think this is a good point to just stop with them. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope it was an insightful watch. The aim was to take some interview snippets and put them on a spotlight so that people can see the series creators' thoughts on things that are relevant at this point of time, if only to put everyone at ease. Any of us may have a problem with recent RGG games, but I think it would be much more constructive to actually look into why a specific thing is a problem rather than just attribute it to Nagoshi leaving when a lot of the old guard are still at the studio. I think we all can have much more meaningful conversations about the franchise's growth that way. What do you guys think of this whole thing? Let me know down in the comments below, and I just want to say again, thank you so much for giving this video your time. And as usual, I also want to give a special thank you to all the Hannya and Dragon members who go above and beyond for the channel. I'm grateful for every single shred of support you show at the channel and myself, so thank you. I hope I can deliver more videos that will be enjoyed, and with that said, that's all for now. Peace!